Sororities. I know. Appreciate that. So I feel like I'm no, it's not like I don't know. Yeah. Do you want to take it back? Exactly. Dog, how are you? I wanted to go. No, I wanted to get over stuff. I don't know. I'm sorry to let you down. Oh, also they're getting a party dress. I didn't like it. So we don't. I feel like the only thing is you're gonna go all the way to the office after. No. And I really sweat them. No, I know. She's like, literally. Yeah.
You? Your win this weekend. That was a bit too close. Win is a win, as they say. Okay, so this morning's plan, we're going to bridge over. My ears look like Prince Charles. What I'd like to do this morning is bridge across topics. We need to wrap up chapter 2 on population. And the wrap up there is food, right? I think it's really important to spend 15, 20 minutes about not just the environmental implications of having 9.7 billion by 2050 or 10.9 by the end of the century, whatever it is. Make that link between population growth and food. And in all truth, I think I'd probably do this a great injustice by just spending 20 minutes on it. But it's not the time that we have. So we'll do that, we'll wrap that up, and then we'll start the material in chapter 3, which is the big section on energy. I do have one lecture, actually a couple, I suppose, sort of installed buffers before that exam, but I'm not too stressed if we don't get through all of energy before the so let's just see how it goes. But the energy conversation this morning is really kind of framing the issue and scene setting before we get into some of the details, and I'll walk you through that. So that's where we're headed. Okay, so this is one of these stats that just blows me away, to be honest, that 1 in 7 people should have been hungry at night. And I don't know about you, and I certainly don't want to do a broad brushstroke and generalize, but I'm not sure I've ever really been to bed truly hungry at night. You know, maybe peckish, maybe a bit more than that, but certainly not multiple days in a row where I've gone without food or feel malnourished or undernourished, right? And yet there are, you know, 1 billion plus people that go to bed hungry at night. That's extraordinary to me, and it's not just people in faraway places, right? This is happening in our backyard. Okay, so let's talk very briefly then about how we use land for agriculture. And this is one of these general maps. You're going to see quite a few of these in this course. You know, we're going to take a step back and look at the general rates of deforestation or general maps of land degradation. This one here shows the global percentage of our terrestrial surface that is covered either in croplands, okay, or used for pasture. So we're talking cows and sheep and goats and so on, would be anywhere towards the reds. And as you start getting closer towards the greens here, you have a higher and higher percentage of land under crops. So wheat, barley, rice, whatever the case may be, right? So that little diagram in the top right there gives you the scale. The numbers here aren't necessarily critical, but it's quite worth, it's useful remembering the relativity of these two numbers. So what we have currently, about 1.56, 1.6 billion hectares of our terrestrial surface is currently under cropland. So remember, I don't know if I mentioned this, but if you're not familiar with what a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, okay? In something that's a bit more sort of you can get your heads around, it's 2 American football fields minus the end zone. So if we took 2 Amon Cotters, took away the end zones, that would almost approximate or be very close to what a hectare is, right? So we've got about 1.5 or so billion hectares under crops, but look at the number under pasture. 3.5 billion hectares are set aside for pasture, right? Now, when you look at this diagram, there are obviously areas like the Central Amazon there, and the great forests of Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's deserts, obviously, in the Sahara and the deserts of Central Australia. Then you've got Siberia and Russia and Upper Canada, the tundra. So there are areas that are not under agriculture, right? But to give you a sense, this diagram here, we are already, I don't know if we're at the limits, but we're pushing the limits of where we can keep going in terms of expanding agriculture, if that makes sense. And I'm going to sort of try and tie that in a little bit in just a moment. Okay. So I don't know if there's anything that strikes you about that diagram. Maybe you came into this class already having some idea. I mean, look at India, for example, right? India has vast areas under cropland with a huge population to support. But the takeaway message here, everybody, is that we do have a fairly, stressful, pressing situation when it comes to the intensification of agriculture and how we use our land. Okay, question.
I'm a little surprised by lack of farmland in the US Southeast. Is
Yeah.
that just by concentration? Is that why probably, or?
Yeah, it's, so there, I mean, there is, right, there's cotton and tobacco and so on, but it just doesn't show up. It's probably in that kind of lightish greenish. Let's see if it's, yeah, I mean, it's there, but it's in that sort of lightish green along the coastal plain. But there's not a whole lot in here. So I'm familiar with North Carolina, that's where I thought. So it probably doesn't show up from where you are, but there's a green strip along the coastal plain, so that's where tobacco is. But yeah, it's not as intensive as you think. Good observation.
South Carolina, so.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, hogs there probably, and chickens.
Lots of hogs and chickens.
That's right. I remember those. Yeah. Any other comments on that? I don't know if that's strikes you surprising. Okay, so just keep that number in the back of your mind. Now, this is going to look like a really bizarre infographic, but I'm going to use this. I'm going to try and use this to illustrate just one point. And this point is not to be pro-meat or anti-meat or pro-vegetarian or anti-vegetarian, right? That's not my goal. I'm not a vegetarian, just in case you were wondering. I'm not a vegan, right? And had on the weekend a nice little 8-ounce fillet, right? That's me. But in terms of feeding the world, it's extraordinary when we think of how much energy is lost by growing crops and certainly setting aside land for cows. Okay, and I guess the catchphrase of this diagram, and I'll explain this in just a second, is that the cows are the real hogs when it comes to consumption and quote unquote how expensive it is to raise them. And when I say expensive, I don't necessarily mean money, I mean in terms of energy. So what's this diagram trying to show here? So on the left shows the percentage of our agricultural land, right? So when we look at our agricultural land, cropland is about 30% and pasture is about 70%, right? I'll go back a second. That's just representing the 1.5 billion and the 3.5 billion. Does that make sense? Okay. So rounding up, we've got about 30% of our land that is grown for crops and about 70% for pastures, right? Now, we can express the energy, okay, in those land uses in terms of the percentage of the biomass, right? What is the biological mass of the energy in those percentages? So what this is trying to show is that cows over here, right? So cows are using all of that energy in the grass, okay, for grazing. So they use all of that, but they also bleed over here. So if you just look up here, the cows bleed over into the cropland because we grow crops to feed animals, right? So we're not just growing crops. In other words, that 30% that's under cropland, that all does not go to producing corn that we eat, right? In fact, the whole bunch of it goes into our vehicles, and that's something that we're going to talk about in the next chapter, right? So we know that energy is created through photosynthesis, right? So the plants absorb sunlight and they turn that radiation into chemical energy. But cows eat a lot of grass and they eat a lot of feed, so they represent a huge proportion of the biomass. But when you look at how much food they actually produce, right, in terms of caloric intake, so the percentage of the biomass here in terms of food, cows only deliver about 8%, if that makes sense, right? So there's an enormous loss of energy up the system, right? Because you're creating energy over here through photosynthesis, and then the cows have to eat a vast amount of that, but they don't produce a huge amount of food at the end of the day, right? So just from an energy perspective and feeding the world, it makes much more sense, right, to circumnavigate the cows and just go straight to the plants. Okay. Now, again, I'm not trying to preach become a vegetarian or not, but just purely from an energy perspective, that makes a lot of sense. The cows are expensive, right? Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that every cow on the planet is raised in an irresponsible way. Not at all. In fact, that's couldn't be further from the truth. One of my, he's a friend of mine and a colleague in the ranch management program here. I don't know if any of you know Jeff Geider. He's the head of the Ranch Management Institute. Amazing dude, right? And he runs this institute where he goes around the world to sort of help and educate communities on how to raise cattle responsibly, sustainably, through rotational grazing and so on. So I'm not for a minute saying we just need to cross out all cows, but just purely from a supply chain perspective, all right, the percentage of food that's delivered at the end of the day. Cows are problematic. They are. Does that make sense? Everybody, right? So you're losing energy along the way. So here's the crux of it all, right? And I know this is an environmental course, so clearly we need to think about the environmental implications of this, and we will as we unpack this course, right? We're going to look at the water quality implications of this. We're going to look at the land degradation implications, the biodiversity, the fragmentation, and the loss of habitats by expanding agriculture. But if we try and summarize this in a graphic, this is the crux of it, okay? The question is, when we get to 2050, and we have, let's say, 10 billion people on the planet, 9.7 or 10, how are we going to feed those 10 billion people? When the science is now beginning to converge around a consensus that we are going to need to produce 50%, maybe 60%, the graphic here says 56%, that's from a very specific research paper. We're going to need to produce somewhere between 50% to 60% more food, right, to feed those extra 2.5 billion people. Does that make sense? Right? If we don't produce more food, where are they going to get their food from? So we are going to need to find a way to increase our food production, probably by 50%, maybe more, to feed these 10 billion people. And on the right-hand side of this diagram, the concept here is without completely messing the planet up. And what I mean by that is without using more land, right? So if we think of that first graphic that has the percentage cropland and the percentage pastures and the greens and the reds, how do we do the left-hand side of this diagram without increasing the reds and the greens on that map, without consuming more land, pushing into marginal lands, pushing into tropical forests, whatever the case may be? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, do you think we currently produce enough food to feed 7.8 billion people? Or not?
We just all distributed well, isn't that right?
So you said no. Yeah, distributed well. Not distributed. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting concept, right? We've got 7.8 billion people, and I've said 1 in 7 go hungry at night. So the implication, I think, or at least one of them, is that we probably are not producing enough food. The flip side of that is we actually are. Okay? In the US, 40% of our food goes to waste. I mean, that just doesn't make sense, right? But it does. We waste a huge amount of food. Some of it goes bad, gets lost in transportation. Global food distribution, okay, we have these concerts where I just watched on the plane back from France last week for about the 10th time Bohemian Rhapsody, right? And the Live Aid concert, okay, I know that's before your time, but I remember watching that live, okay, and devastating scenes of famine around the world, and you raise all this money, and then a few years later, we seem to be back at square one, right? So there's corruption in the system, the distribution is not ideal. We see scenes of food sitting on trucks and not getting to where it's needed. So it's a very, very complicated thing, this notion of the production and the distribution of food. So there is an argument that we produce enough food, we're just not getting it to right? Okay. So let me wrap food up here then. And I acknowledge this is a chronic underrepresentation of the issue. So I want to use this diagram. I came up with this diagram, and because I came up with it, you're going to see it in example. So take this one to the bank. But it's a way just to try and get you to think about how we move forward with the complexity of population growth and our dependency on land. Now, it's quite a busy diagram because there are 3 axes here, right? So the simple one here is this axis, which is population, right? So that's population in billions. And it's so weird how these projectors show things. That's on my computer, that's a green line. Huh. So this line here is population. Unfortunately, it's come out, that's the same color as the land, but that's supposed to be green. And that's the population curve, right? So population in billions. And then we've got cropland in hectares. So cropland in billions of hectares is this down here, right? These vertical brown bars. That shows how we have slowly increased and expanded mechanized agriculture. So from 1960s, we're just under 1 billion hectares under production, and I've circled there 2020, that's 1.56 billion hectares. So that shows the increase in cropland, right? The red line is essentially the inverse between those two, right? The red line relates to the right-hand axis here, and that's the arable land, but it's expressed in how many hectares per capita, right? So we're taking the total 1.56 billion the production in 2020 and just dividing it by the population, right? That tells you how many hectares we have per person on the planet to produce our food. Does that make sense, everybody? Right, to the red line. So obviously here, as population goes up from 1960, where it's at 3 billion, to where it currently is at 7.8 billion, okay? And yeah, we're increasing the area under production, but not nearly as quickly as population's going up. So the red line's going down. We are shrinking the area that's available to us in terms of the arable land expressed on a per capita basis. So we are currently now, if we were to just project this out here, this little dot here, we're currently at about 0.2 hectares per person on the planet. And that has gone down from 0.45 in 1960, right? So the football field is shrinking in terms of the available land that we can grow food on, if that makes sense, right? So 0.2 hectares would be going from the goal line out to the 20-yard line across 2 football fields. That's how much arable land there is per person to grow food on the planet. Does that make sense? Okay. And then, of course, the question is, now what happens, right? What is likely to happen as we go through to 2050? Okay. So there are some scenarios here, right? We know that population is almost certainly, well, let me back up a second. Let's assume that we're not going to put another acre or hectare under production. Okay. So let's keep the cropland horizontal, and I've just extended that dot here across over there. So we'll keep the arable land at 1.56 billion through to 2050. Well, clearly something's got to give here. We know that population is going to go up, right? So population rises from 7 billion, 7.8 billion to 9.5 billion. And if the arable land stays the same and the population goes up, well, then the only obvious thing that can happen is that the arable land per capita will continue to come down, right? We continue to shrink that amount of land per person, if that makes sense. So how are we going to deal with that? If that happens, if we don't put any more land under production, the population goes to 9.5 billion and the arable land is shrinking, what do? We're going to have to do things like dramatically increase crop yields, right? You've probably heard of the Green Revolution, okay, which was a fantastic revolution that increased crop yields. We're going to have to do something that is called reducing the yield gap. So the yield gap is, if we're growing corn on a hectare in Iowa, how many bushels do we get from that hectare in Iowa versus a hectare, say, in the Ivory Coast, just as a random example, right? Well, we get more corn from Iowa because of fertilizers and the mechanized agriculture. Perhaps the climate's more conducive to it. So we have to try and quote unquote squeeze more food out of a known hectare around the world. Okay? So that's a challenge. That's the challenge we face. Of course, the alternative is to say, let's keep the arable land at 0.2 hectares per person. And if we keep the arable land here at 0.2 hectares per person, then the only thing we can do is follow that dashed line up here, line B, which is the projected demand in agricultural land. If we're going to say we cannot go below 0.2 hectares per person, right? That means we're going to have to go from 1.5 to 1.6 to 1.7 to 1.8 billion hectares. Where is that land? Well, it isn't. We're going to have to start going into other areas. Yeah.
Like the amount of land available.
Yeah.
Is that always set in stone? Like growth, or as far as like people needing to live?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So the question is that arable land, so is that 1.56 billion hectares? Are you asking, is that set in stone?
Yeah,
Right.
like the land as we go in the future. Is
Yeah.
that-
So no, it's not set in stone, right? So that's the question. The question is, so let's take that a step further. That's a really good question. So here we are at 1.56 billion, right? So this assumption is it is set in stone. We're not going to go into anywhere. And the population grows, therefore we come down this red line here. But let's assume it's not set in stone. So if it's not set in stone, we can go from 1.56, and let's say you're the head of agriculture for the entire planet, and you decide that we need to go to 2 billion hectares of cropland. Bless you. You're going to go to 2 billion hectares, you're going to follow that dashed line. Because remember, it's the far left-hand axis. So the question is, where are we going to get that land from? Okay, there's not 400 million hectares just sitting, waiting somewhere going, come on, farmers, come on down. This is virgin soil just ready to go. Right? There's not. We're going to get this from somewhere. Where's that somewhere? Probably going to be forests, right? You're going to see that very close link between deforestation and agriculture, right? Or it's going to be tundra, or it's going to be increasingly marginal lands that are steep or erodible, or whatever the case may be. Does that kind of, yeah, it's a really good question. So no, it's not set in stone. Any other questions on food? Yeah, fascinating topic, right? So yeah. It's not just an environmental issue. Clearly, we're going to need to focus on the environmental impacts of food production as we go deeper into this course. It's obviously also a humanitarian. Okay. So any final thoughts on food before we move on to chapter 3? Yes.
Do you think that hydroponics and increase in industrial agriculture would fix the problem? I know that just in my own looking into this, countries like Japan and China have started these tower-like hydroponics
Vertical
facilities that allows you to essentially stack land on top of it until you get to the top of the building.
Yeah, so a good question as well. I saw that in Singapore as well. You go by a building and you see this, it's called vertical agriculture, right? So there's hydroponics, there's aquaponics as well, okay, where you're growing vegetables in basically fish tanks, and we've set up a whole hydroponic aquaponic system at the game reserve in South Africa. The problem is scale, right? That's the issue. You can do that, right? But how do you scale it up to go, okay, so we need to feed 2 billion people off this hydroponic system. And I don't mean that cynically. I think that's an important concept that you'll see, especially in chapter 3 when we look at energy, right? How do we A lot of these issues are issues of scale. How do we scale it up? We can have an aquaponic system or a hydroponic system at the game reserve when we're trying to feed 100 people in 5 lodges, and we're growing lettuce and tomatoes, and that all works. But how do we scale that up to try and reduce that 1 in 7 go hungry at night? Any comment? Yeah.
Is it possible that the amount of land we have available right now is going to decrease over the years? Because the more we use it, the soil quality will decrease, and then erosion, and more people are going to need places to live.
So that's a great point. And unfortunately, we're already there, right? So when we get much deeper into this course, we're going to spend a session or two talking about land degradation and soil erosion. And like a lot of people are like, really, we're going to talk about soil. But I can, in the introduction, I made that comment that an area the size of India and China has already been lost to pollution, physical compaction, and erosion. And you can't get that back. It's really hard to go into the Gulf of Mexico and start scraping soil back and putting it onto agricultural land. So that's the conundrum, is that this extra, 400 million hectares, okay, which is not static, is not just potentially shrinking because of population growth, but oh, by the way, we're losing soil due to environmental degradation. So it's a really good point. Yeah. Now, I know that sounds like really dramatic, right? And it's not that this is going to impact whether I can go to the Cheesecake Factory on Saturday night or not at all. But when we start extrapolating out 20 to 30 years, issues of scale, issues of equal distribution, then it really does play out into an important issue. Yeah.
As far as like, we'll probably get into it a lot. But,
Yeah.
So as far as like certain areas, I know one lot faster, is it possible that we change more land as far as to grow plants? Well, I guess.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting comment, and we are going to talk about that, right? We're going to, once we get through exam 1, then we'll get to the atmosphere, and yeah, we're going to talk about climate change a lot, not just because, I find it an interesting topic, but of all the issues, it is the one that's kind of right at the forefront of the public's attention, the media, and it is one that kind of sort of is an umbrella issue that that sort of subsumes the other ones. And often in the conversation about climate change, it's all doom and gloom and negative, right? But there are going to be some winners, right? As the planet warms, we're going to see some thawing of the tundra, and that could potentially open up a lot of land to agriculture. That sounds great. Until you start thinking about all the potential methane that's sitting underneath the tundra that makes it, you know, so it's a very complicated thing. But yeah, there will be, you know, maybe we'll be growing fabulous Bordeaux wines in Scotland. I mean, that's a good thing, right? As the temperature warms, but we'll get a bit more serious near that time. Yeah. Any other comments on food? Okay, cool. Okay, perfect. 25 minutes to set the scene. Right. Who of you here has a family member that is directly involved in the energy game? I know I am. Any of you? Yeah. What sector?
My dad does like renewable energy.
Ooh, I like him already. No, I shouldn't. What is it? Solar, wind, or something?
Yeah, solar.
Okay, cool. Anybody else? My father-in-law was president of his own oil and gas company. So might have to look well. So not my personal family, but my wife's family is in oil and gas. Anybody else in the energy sector? There's normally quite a lot, right?
Works for BP. I don't know what he does exactly, but
Okay.
something with oil.
BP. Yeah, normally in Fort Worth there's a bunch.
Family and oil stuff.
Oil. So O&G is obviously quite big there, right? Oil and gas. We're sitting on top of the Barnett Shale. Texas is an energy state. So here's where we're going to go. And let me kind of preface all of this with, I hope, and it's my hope throughout this course, right? But I hope in this section in particular that I'm able to give you a pragmatic, realistic, honest look at our energy challenge, right? The so-called transition that we're moving towards. We start thinking about, and we hear in the media, a cleaner, greener future, the energy transformation, right? Let's look at that, and obviously with an eye on the environment, okay? So here's the roadmap for today and everything up to the first exam. I want to talk about distribution, production, consumption. I want to just give you some very broad, again, 40,000 foot look at some of the energy issues. Right? So we're going to do that. Then, yeah, we're going to talk about fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Right? Again, it'll be a broad brushstroke on what we have, where it is, and what do we do with it. Then we're going to look at nuclear. Right? Is nuclear a realistic option? Okay. We need to look at the environmental impact of nuclear. I can tell you right now, this is the giveaway sort of spoiler alert. Nothing beats nuclear. Nothing beats nuclear in terms of the biggest bang for your buck. In the amount of electricity or energy, we'll talk specifically about electricity, you can't come close to nuclear, right? So we're going to look at that. And then, yeah, we're going to get to renewables and some of the questions moving forward. So that's kind of how I've spaced this out. Right? And again, I'm going to try and be as objective as I can here. One concept I just want to get out there, it is an important one, and that is this terminology between reserves and resources. And I see a lot of confusion in online and in the literature about this. So here's how I use this, and I think this is pretty consistent with sort of the general academy on how we use these terms. So in this diagram, there's no numbers here. It's just a two-dimensional space. On the top from left to right, we've got least economic to highly profitable, right? So you cannot make money. You're printing money on the right-hand side across the top. Vertically here from the bottom, we've got least known. So we're not quite sure at all if this deposit is there, through to the best known. We know where it is. We know how thick it is. It's been mapped. All good, right? Anything that plots in the top right-hand corner there that I've called reserves in that box, okay, means that we know where it is and we can get it out and get it to market and make a profit on it, right? It is economically profitable. That's known as an economic reserve or geologic reserve. So if I talk about coal reserves or oil reserves, that's what I mean, right? It means it's currently mapped to a depth, we know where it is, we can get it out. Everything else here in this blue is an economic resource. At least that's the correct terminology. Now, some people use them interchangeably, but a resource is not quite there yet, right? Either it's in the top left-hand corner. In other words, we know exactly where it is, but we don't have the technology and we can't get it out and sell it at a profit. And that happened right under our feet in a formation known as the Barnett Shale, right? So the shale is a geologic formation. It's right under our feet here in the Barnett Basin in Fort Worth. And that shale is down at about 7,000 feet, and it contains high volumes of gas, right? But it contains gas in very tiny pore spaces. We'll talk about this a little later on. And it was sitting up in the top left-hand corner. They knew exactly where it was. They drilled down, they could see it, they could map it, okay? But there was no technology to get it out because it was held in such small pore spaces. Until in the mid-1980s, a guy came along by the name of George Mitchell and discovered directional drilling and hydraulic fracking, or fracturing, a term you may have heard, right? Where you pump water and steam in at very high pressures and you basically fracture or shatter the rock, and then the gas starts flowing, okay? That shifted the Barnett from the top left to the right-hand side. It became a reserve because it became profitable. So a geologic formation can move around that diagram, right? Depending on the market price and the technologies to get it out. I hope that makes sense. So if I use reserve, it means it's economically profitable to get it out. All right. Now, I know there's quite a lot of data and information in this book in terms of numbers, and I will point you as we go through this, everybody, on things that I would want you to remember. Right now, I'm not concerned at all if you know exactly what percentage we get our energy from in terms of natural gas and oil. But the big number in the middle is a useful one, right? So this picture is at the end of 2020, and it shows where the world, this is globally, where we get our energy from. Not just not just electricity, but energy as a whole, right? So this is where we get our energy from globally. 34% comes from oil, 27% comes from coal, 24% comes from natural gas, right? So oil, obviously, the major constituent in transportation, the refining of oil to produce petroleum products and gasoline and jet fuel and all sorts of things. Coal, almost exclusively used to generate electricity, right? And natural gas as well, electricity and transportation. The others you can see at the top, hydropower, nuclear, and renewables. And that renewables, the green, and yes, I have to color them green, includes solar and wind and biogas and things like that, right? But what's the reality of that? What's the pragmatic reality of that in 2020, do you think? You look at our current energy portfolio globally. This varies tremendously depending on where you are around the planet. What's the reality check here, do you think? Energy perspective. So they are a finite resource, right? These fossil fuels, that's why we call them fossils, because they take so long to form. You can't go, you can't go outside and say, we're going to wait a couple of weeks and then we'll just generate some more coal. I mean, it takes millions of years. There's also another reality to this, right? That reality, so here we are in 2020. So we're talking about a transformation. What does that transformation look like? Okay. When I hang around my people, the sort of eco-environmental people, they want that central part to go away as quickly as possible, right? People are divesting from oil and gas. We don't take coal out of the ground, right? Move away from oil. We don't want fracking anywhere near us. They want that 85% to disappear. How are we going to do that? Money, right? Yeah. I mean, how are we going to do that?
Renewables bigger.
Right. So that green one, they want that green one to just do this. That, yeah. I mean, right? Your body language says, yeah. Now, is it doable in 10 years? Probably not. 20, 30, maybe, right? And certainly it may be doable in certain countries, right? That's one of the things I'll unpack for you. It's not doable in China, even though China has committed to be net zero. That means carbon neutral by 2060. Currently get 70% of their electricity from coal. Are they going to do that? Right? So there is an enormous challenge. There's a practical, pragmatic thing that we just have to acknowledge here. That doesn't mean to say it's hopeless, and it doesn't mean to say that the energy transformation. Thanks for letting me know. But there's an enormous challenge here for reducing that central circle. All right, here's another. I love this diagram. It's a couple years old, but again, lots of detail here that you do not have to remember for an exam. It's the concept that's important here. So what are we looking at here? On the left axis here, so this is proven oil reserves, right? Proven oil reserves around the planet. Assuming, so there's a caveat to this, assuming those reserves are extractable and we can sell them for a profit. Now, that may be confusing because if you think of that two-dimensional box, they're sliding across the top. They may become a resource, they may become a reserve. But let's just assume for the moment that this is a diagram of proven reserves in billions of barrels, okay? And this is oil. So that's proven reserves. On the right-hand side is the percent of the global total. You see the countries along the bottom. And then I've got the United States scaled to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. Not scaled in terms of the actual size of the country, but scaled in terms of the reserves, right? The proven reserves. Okay? Does that make sense? So the United States here, you can see that in the middle of that diagram is 69 to 70 billion barrels. Okay. So what's up with this diagram? What's the challenge here? Proven oil reserves. Anything surprise you? Something surprises you on the cropland one. Let's see if something strikes you as odd on this one. Who wants to have a stab at this? What are some of the implications of this diagram? Yeah.
I know you touched on this in the chapter, but of the textbook, but could you explain a little bit more why Venezuela is the highest, but not included in the diagram?
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, good question. So Venezuela is the highest. That may or may not have surprised you, right? It's not included in the diagram because the diagram, I just wanted to make one point in that diagram. Okay. Which I'll get to in a second. So how can Venezuela have the highest oil reserves? That seems odd. Why wouldn't it be Saudi Arabia, front and center? And what about these pesky Canadians? Right, look at Canada. Venezuela and Canada are the first and third country in the world in terms of the oil reserves sitting there. Problem with Venezuela and Canada. What's the problem? What?
They're inaccessible.
Shout it out.
They're inaccessible.
So keep going. They're inaccessible. Yeah, why? What are they? Okay, you're right on top of it. They are very hard to get at.
Is it because they're nationalized?
No.
The actual type of oil, it's really,
The type of oil? Yeah. What type is it?
I can't remember. It's like really isn't it called crude oil? But like on the
Well, no. So there's different. There's crude oil, and we talk about light crude and sweet crude and sour. That's a quality issue. Crude oil is crude oil, but these are what we call unconventional reservoirs versus conventional reservoirs. Right? A conventional reservoir is something like we have in the Gulf of Mexico or in Saudi Arabia, which is essentially, it's not the right way to think about it, but it's essentially a pool of oil sitting in the rock, right? So oil will form in a source rock, and then it'll migrate and flow, and it'll pool itself into a reservoir. Think of it as an underground swimming pool, right? That's a conventional reservoir. Why? Because you drill down into it, and it's like pulling into, I don't know, In-N-Out Burger, and you get one of their milkshakes, and you just put a straw in it, and you pump it out, right? That's a conventional reservoir. An unconventional reservoir is when the oil is held in tiny, tiny pore spaces, like the Barnett Shale. In Venezuela and Canada, they are what we call oil sands or tar sands. Has anybody heard of that? Yeah, so these are oil sands. So it's sandy deposits where the oil is held in very, very tiny pore spaces. You can't put a pump in there and just pull it out, right? You have to force it out along a process very similar to hydraulic fracking. It's extremely detrimental to the environment. It's very expensive to do, right? You've got to pump water in at very high pressures. You've got to push steam in there, and you've got to put it under very high temperatures. And how do you do that? Well, you're using natural gas, and we'll explain all of that in just a bit. The point on this diagram is that Venezuela and Canada have enormous reserves, right? Venezuela 17, Canada 10. I mean, almost a quarter of the world's oil is sitting in these two countries. Okay, but it's dirty, and it's referred to very often as heavy crude because it's dirty. And it requires very sophisticated refineries to refine that into petroleum products. And guess who has the most sophisticated refineries in the world? Well, we do. Okay, so we import that oil from Venezuela and Canada, but we don't really think about the environmental impacts of what it takes to get there. And I'll show you that when we get to it. Question, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I know you like.
So yeah, so it's a good question, and perhaps I probably should relabel this proven oil reserves / resources to be more correct. But because it's reserves where you actually, so it depends on the price of oil, to be totally frank with you, right? So when the price of oil is $60 to $65 a barrel, then all of that is reserves. It's all proven reserves, right? When it's $30 a barrel, Venezuela and Canada's bar charts will go down significantly. Does that make sense? So it's hard to kind of portray that dynamic aspect in a chart like this, but that's a really good point. We're just assuming that we can get it out. Now, if we can get it out at $65 a barrel, the environmental implications is what we'll talk about a little later. Right? Look at that. What other aspects? I think we could spend 2 hours on this diagram. Let's get this down. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. Those are the 3 stable, friendly allies. Any geopolitical issues here?
None at all.
No, not at all. No, it's all good. Yeah, all good, right? So problematic, right? You look at some of those countries, so these countries, not those three in particular are, but there are several countries that are part of OPEC. You probably heard of OPEC, right? The oil producing and exporting countries. In many ways control the global market, okay? And they really don't like the whole North American or US fracking situation because which country produces the most oil? Do you think which country produces the most oil? Produced in 2020 the most oil. No, we don't have the most, we produce the most, right? About technology, being able to go after more of these unconventional reservoirs. But yeah, there's some geopolitical concerns here, for sure, right? You've probably heard of this phrase. We hear it a lot. I heard it a lot. I heard it in President Biden's campaign. I heard it in President Trump's campaign. I heard it in President Obama's campaign, and especially President Bush's campaign, independent of whether you're red or blue, right? I heard it every single State of the Union. Okay? We want to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, right? And we're doing that. We're absolutely doing that. We've been extremely successful in doing it. But we still import lots of oil, right? This may surprise you. The 5 largest sources of US petroleum imports. Okay, so petroleum, so there's crude oil that you get out, and then you refine that into a variety of petroleum products. And so petroleum is slightly different. This is the share of total petroleum imports as a percentage. Okay, look at Canada. We get 43% of our petroleum / oil imports from Canada. Not such a geopolitically problematic area. Canadians are friendly. Okay. We get 9% from Saudi Arabia, Mexico 7, Venezuela 6, Iraq 5. The Canadian oil that we get, what I'm trying to portray on the bottom here is, there's the maple leaf, right? There's the 166.7 billion barrels of oil in Canada, right? From that previous diagram, or at least it should be on that previous diagram. There's Canada, right? So Canada's line here goes up to 166 billion, right? That one right there. So there's Canada at 166 billion, but almost all of it is sitting in oil sands. very, very tricky to go after, right? And that's part of the argument against something like the Keystone Pipeline, which I'm going to talk about next time, is what should we even go after this? Okay? I think a lot of people assume that we get a huge proportion of our oil from Saudi Arabia. We don't. We get 9%, and that has been declining quite substantially over the years, right? So are we reducing our dependence on foreign oil? Well, you know, if Canada's a foreign country, then probably not. Okay? Or are we reducing our dependence on Middle East oil? We have been, for sure. Does that make sense? Okay. So where we go from here is I need a little bit more context on electricity, okay, which is a major driver of the energy picture. And then we're going to pick these apart in terms of fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, nuclear, and renewable. That's where we're at. Any questions? Thoughts or comments? All right. Great, gang. Have a good day. We'll see you back here Wednesday.